Let's start some new learning in a new video series, this one about comparing groups on a quantitative response variable. What we've been looking at is multiple linear regression, in which we have a quantitative explanatory variable or multiple quantitative explanatory variables, thus multiple linear regression, and a single quantitative response variable. We're going to stick with the single quantitative response variable, but now the explanatory variable is going to be categorical instead of quantitative. Will we still be doing multiple linear regression? Yes, we will. It may not look that way at first, but I will show you as we go along how we are still doing multiple linear regression, albeit with a categorical explanatory variable instead of quantitative explanatory variables. We'll talk more about that as we go. Now, if you think about comparing groups on a quantitative response variable, and assuming, as I do, that you have taken a first statistics course, you should realize that you have done this. When you compared two groups on a quantitative response variable, looking, for instance, at side-by-side box plots, getting descriptive statistics for each of the groups and comparing statistics, especially the means, and then inferentially doing the two-sample t-test, that was all looking at a quantitative response variable and a single grouping variable in which you had two groups. The difference here is I'm no longer saying comparing two groups on a quantitative response variable, so we may be looking at two or more groups. Any number of groups could be part of our explanatory categorical variable. As always, we begin with a research question. The question here is going to be a specific question that clearly identifies the groups. That will be the explanatory variable. And note here, each group is not an explanatory variable. Collectively, they are an explanatory variable. And then we have a quantitative response variable. Our research question should either be based in theory, which is my preferred way of looking at research questions. Always, it's the nature of science to start with theories, then make hypotheses, and then look at data to see if what you expect is what you actually observe. But we may also, without a theory, anticipate group differences on a quantitative response measure. The groups can be either formed by experimental conditions, that is, we could randomly assign participants in our study to groups, or they may be existing groups, groups that exist that we then categorize individuals based upon a pre-existing categorical explanatory variable, and we categorize individuals into the levels of that variable. And then, as we will see, a broad research question may lead to a series of more specific questions. So to set this up, let's go ahead and look at a data set that I'm going to use throughout this video series. These data I call the plain risk data. They come from an actual study that appeared in the journal Risk Analysis in 2000. And there's a much larger data set in which the researchers looked at perception of risk for a whole lot of different characteristics, different types of activities that the participants may be involved in. But I have selected just a subset of these data, and I'm looking specifically at how participants answered a question that the researcher asked about their perception of risk of traveling on an airplane once every month. Researchers also asked questions that allowed them to categorize the participants into one of three worldviews. These data include only those who are categorized into one of those views because there were additional types of worldviews, or they may not have been able to categorize the individuals at all. So the categories are based upon a particular theory. Let's take a look at that. It's a grid group typology theory that comes from Mary Douglas, an anthropologist. As you can see, there's a lot of text here. I'm not going to read it all. I'm going to give it an overview. But I would invite you, so that you can better understand the data that we're working with, to pause on this page and read through about these three different worldviews. So each different view is based upon either being low or high on grid, which refers to the degree to which individuals' choices are circumscribed by their position in society, or group, which refers to the degree of solidarity among members of the society. And this idea did not even originate with Mary Douglas, who came up with this grid group typology, but rather came back to work on another sociologist. And it's in keeping with some things that have been in a book. You can read more about that here. But let's take a look at the three worldviews we're going to look at. Individualists are low on grid. Remember, that refers to how the degree to which individual choices are circumscribed by their position. So being low on grid, meaning it's not really depending upon their position. They don't really give a lot of attribution to that. And low on group, which is a degree of solidarity. And so if you think about it, the term individualist makes sense. The person does not see themselves as pertaining to a certain position in the group that requires them to do anything, nor do they see a lot of solidarity amongst the group. The egalitarian is low on grid and high on group. So being high on group, they are high on this idea of solidarity among members of society, but they don't see their place in that society as having a whole lot of impact on their choices. That's the egalitarian. And then the hierarchist experiences high grid and high group. So they see the society as being important, a lot of solidarity, and they having a particular position in the society that should influence what they do. That's the hierarchist. So this is just a really brief overview. I do invite you to pause and read this page thoroughly so you understand better what we're talking about here. But let's go back to the variables themselves. So there's a score that's a perception of risk from 0 to 100 that individuals score themselves. That is, they are indicating through a variety of questions, they're indicating how they score in terms of some sort of risk factor. And then the researchers, totaling these all up, come up with a score that's going to range anywhere from 0 to 100, with 100 meaning that they have a very, very high as you can get in terms of your perception of the risk of needing to fly in an airplane every month. The worldview category, which here the variable is view, that worldview category is assigned to each individual, or rather measured in each individual, that is, based upon other questions on this survey. The researchers are able to categorize individuals as to which one of these three they fit into. And remember, there were other possibilities as well, but those people are not included in the study. I'm only including, or at least they're not included in the data that I selected. I only included the individualist, hierarchist, and egalitarian, and those are numbered 1, 2, and 3 in the data set. So let's go ahead and actually load the data set and take a look. I've already created an R notebook that I called Plain Risk Analysis Example. I am starting with clearing my environment on line 9. I am loading the Here library on line 10, which allows me to access my data in a data folder, no matter what my particular computer is that I'm working on, as long as the data folder is off of my home folder for the project, I can access it. and the data are called the plain risk data. They originally were given to me, or I collected them in an Excel spreadsheet, which is often the case, but I convert them to a CSV file prior to reading in with the read.csv function. So I'm going to go ahead and load these in, and you can see over here in the environment we have 225 observations of 2 variables, and 1 variable score, 1 variable is view. Now note when you look at these right now, these variables, that they both look numeric. That is, they're at least both numerals. The view is not numeric, it is just a numeral. A numeral is a number-like label. And in this case, it's a number-like label for a category, not just a category, but unordered categories. We would call this nominal data. So we're using these numerals rather than numbers because numbers indicate an amount. A numeral is just a label. A numeral to indicate which category these individuals are in. And you may remember back from the code sheet that 1 is individualist, 2 is hierarchicalist, and 3 is egalitarian. So these have to be changed into something that R will recognize as categorical when I start to do the analysis. Right now, it's going to think that these are numbers. It's going to think that 2 is more than 1 and 3 is more than 2. It's not going to think that 1 is just a label. What we call categorical variables within R and elsewhere are factors. So whenever we deal with a categorical variable, we can refer to it as a factor, and the levels of the categorical variable are indeed the levels of our factor. So the very first thing I'm going to do to prepare to analyze these data is I'm going to go ahead and set these up as a factor for this view variable. So let me go ahead and do that. So I've gone ahead and typed this in. I did it without recording, so it's looking like time lapse for you. And what you can see here is that I have added some code on what's now line 13. So remember that when we looked at these data that we had numerals for view, but I'm going to change view, asking R to make it a factor. And the way I do that is to give one argument here to tell it how many levels there are, and that the numerals are 1 to 3. So this just tells it 1 through 3 levels. And then the labels that this factor should have. Now, if I did not give it labels, it would go ahead and keep the 1, 2, and 3, but it would treat those as categories instead of as the numbers. So what I have here now is categories that are going to have labels. Let's go ahead and run that line. And let's take a look again at our data. And now you can see that the 1s, 2s, and 3s have all been replaced in order. The 1 had to go with, in my code, the 1 had to go with individualist, the 2 had to go with the second one, and the 3 had to go with the third one. If I wanted to switch the orders of these, I could just switch the orders of the levels. Like if I had wanted to put egalitarian second, even though it was 3, I could have told it that the levels are 1, 3, and 2, like that. And then it would have switched the order for me. But I went ahead and kept it in the order in which it was coded. So let's make sure that everything runs good. There it is. And I now have, you can see here, a score that's numeric and a view that is a factor with the 3 levels. So we can have 2 kinds of research questions when we have more than 2 groups. Broad questions will focus on relationship or comparisons, such as, is worldview related to perception of risk? Remember that we also had broad questions when we did the multiple linear regression with multiple quantitative explanatory variables, we would ask a broad question like, is the model accounting for some proportion of the variation in the response variable? That was a broad question. When we looked at the individual coefficients attached to each of our quantitative explanatory variables, looking at those coefficients and seeing what the effect was on each of those and building confidence intervals for those effects, that was all specific. That was honing in on the effectiveness of each of the explanatory variables while holding the others constant. So the broad question and specific question terminology is something we may not have focused on much there, but it was in play. And here we could have broad questions such as worldview related to perception of risk. Are there any differences in the perception of risk for individuals with different worldviews? And indeed, those two questions actually are bound together. If the worldview is related to perception of risk, then there are going to be differences in the perception of risk for individuals with different worldviews. Specific questions are often of interest when there are more than two groups. When you only have two groups, the broad and the specific question are really the same, so it's just a question. But now we could ask things like, do individualists perceive risk differently than egalitarians? Do individualists perceive risk differently than hierarchists? Do egalitarians perceive risk differently than hierarchists? These are all specific questions that we could ask. And in fact, if we had a theory that we were familiar with, I am not familiar with theory about risk or about worldviews, but if we were dealing with a theory that we were familiar with, we might even want to ask these as one-sided questions. That is, we have hypotheses that we think, for instance, that individualists will perceive higher risk than egalitarians or the other way around. So the way I have it listed here is really in an exploratory vein. That is there any difference here? Not, do I anticipate one group to be higher than the other group? So these are the kinds of research questions we deal with when we have a single explanatory categorical variable, albeit with multiple groups, multiple levels of that categorical variable, and a single quantitative response variable. I'm going to go ahead and pause here, stop this video, and I'll see you again as we explore this further and begin to dive into how to do the analysis in the next video.